everybody, welcome to today's webinar. My name's Laura Hill and I head up Cloud Essentials here in the UK, and I'm your host for today for a conversation around Office 365 tenant migration. So our aim for today is that you will come away with some practical food for thought if you're planning a tenant migration, having benefited from some of the lessons that we've learned as a team over the past couple of years. So we're going to walk through these 5 topics today, selected as some of our top areas of consideration. But as we go through, please use the questions box that it's available to you, and tell us why you're here. Fire any comments, any questions to our presenters who are with us today, who I will introduce now. So Chris is one of the founders of Cloud Essentials and is someone with a lot of experience, having ridden many waves of technology migration over the past 20 years. It's joined by Johan, who leads our technical team and is a very experienced cloud architect, and he has been responsible for the design and execution of most of the tenant migrations that we've worked on over the past few years. And he also keeps a very sharp eye on migration technologies out there, putting vendors really through their paces for the technologies that we've carefully chosen to automate and streamline a lot of the migration processing work that we do. Brandon also joins us today to discuss sort of some of the latter stages of the migration, bringing his experience of projects as the sort of changes roll out to end users. So Chris is going to start us off today, but before I hand over to him, I did just want to give a little bit of context really as to why Cloud Essentials are hosting this, how we've come to acquire experience in tenant migration and just some of the trends that we are seeing. So Cloud Essentials are a long-standing Microsoft partner, where if you sort of look at the ecosystem of partners around Microsoft, content management is more sort of the space that we're in, and we've delivered content migration as part of that in many different forms over the past 2 decades. So early days of Office 365, we were really recognized by Microsoft as a partner that could sort of break down barriers of cloud adoption because of our migration capability. And that's really continued. We're a strategic partner for Microsoft that can not only successfully deliver an entire tenant migration, but also happily tackle legacy content that's maybe still holding businesses back in their cloud strategy and is costing them a lot of money. So yeah, right now Johan's team are busy in projects to migrate from file share platforms, Box, Dropbox, helping customers disentangle themselves from archives or moving legacy document management systems into more modern platforms, primarily built around Office 365. But because our focus is on more content management, it means that we don't just look at the tenant environment with sort of blinkers on, getting it from A to B. We're very quick to tune into where your business is heading with its ongoing journey of content, like emails, files, how you're collaborating, and the sort of strategy that you're pursuing as you try and keep pace with security and governance over your content. So our customers get to sort of tap into that and also tap into things like our compliance advisory practice for sort of joining up that conversation around content between IT and compliance teams. So yeah, moving into some of the sort of themes for today, mergers and acquisitions are the most common trigger for a tenant migration, and M&A activity is reported to be higher right now than it ever has been before. And for you, that might mean a one-off event that maybe you hope you're never going to have to tackle ever again. Or for some of our highly acquisitive customers, actually absorbing other tenants is getting pretty familiar. But either way, a tenant migration can mean a big diversion of your IT team's energy, and if anything like the last 12-18 months can possibly actually come at a time when there's a lot of other transformational changes going on in the business. So added to that, then comes the pressure, the expectation on IT integration as a sort of key marker of success in a merger or acquisition. So businesses really need to yield those tangible results from any acquisition. So often the remit of the tenant migration is not necessarily just the migration itself, but how quickly the IT function can emerge out of the migration and really accelerate those business objectives. And that's certainly got a lot to do with how quickly people in the business can communicate with each other, can collaborate, and can access the content that they need to do their jobs, when they need it. Which is why we really wanted to start our conversation with you today around sort of looking at the wider context of migration and how that then flows down deep into planning and designing the project. So I'm going to hand over to Chris to sort of kick that off. Chris, I think you might be on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. We had to do that, didn't we? Yeah, so thanks, Laura. I think everyone can hear me now. I think, taking on from what you've just really discussed it sounds obvious, but the why dictates so much of the project scope when you start to build out the requirements and set expectations for the challenges you need to overcome, particularly in these tenant migrations. We worked in such a diverse range of contexts for tenant migration, from high-profile acquisitions to amalgamating disparate tenants that have been sort of getting by, operating in silos, to highly sensitive divestitures with lots of politics and Chinese security walls to factor in. We've even seen a tenant migration required because someone made a really poor choice in naming their tenant with the IT admin's name in the initial setup, and suddenly this name appeared in many of the URLs and links that were being used on the tenant. I think so. Maybe just to cover off more the reasons for migration establishes a range of questions that you really need to consider to create the policies, controls, and settings in the new tenant. So a few examples that we've worked with and some of the experiences we've had is, for example, in a merger or acquisition, there really is, first of all, I think, quite a different sense of kind of togetherness. The organizations are going forward together. So there's an opportunity to balance both the security and governance policies which apply to both, but also look at potentially what's good for both organizations going into the future. And that's important because there is, there's definitely more cooperation between the organizations. Some of the other scenarios we've worked in is, for example, geographical, where we've had different geographical data locations or data changes, and here either, for example, a region, one of the Microsoft data centers perhaps wasn't available when the tenant was created, or, for example, it's a large global business. They've run a relatively federated IT organization, and in the scenario potentially there are a number of regions have their own tenants, and as the organization looks to the efficiencies and potentially from licensing by being able to do the licensing centrally, and then also looking to centralize control around both security and governance, there's potentially a requirement to bring some of those tenants back under a single tenant umbrella. The other example we've had, which is slightly different, is, for example, organizations which, from a geopolitical perspective, have, for example, a business in China, where there's actually a legal requirement that the business in China sits in a tenant within China, on the other side of the Great Wall of China, as it were, the Great Electronic Wall of China. So different scenarios there from the geo side of things. In a divestiture situation, these are usually a little more tricky. In this situation, we've had experience of businesses that are right sizing or that are going back to their core, their core business and looking to sell off parts of the business. The other slightly tricky thing here is usually when they sell those subsidiaries or subsections of their business, they're often selling them to somebody in the same vertical or even a competitor in the industry. So it's a lot more. There's a lot more sensitivities around the tooling and the process we use to actually carve out just the information that's pertinent to that business, because you really are now having to separate the information out of an existing business to be able to migrate that information over to either the new subsidiary if it's going on its own, or if it's actually joining another organization. And we found we've needed to broker and create a lot of trust around scoped permissions and making sure only access to the relevant information is available, and win the trust of particularly the business that's selling the organization in that example. To give an example, we've worked with a global catering and hygiene business where the remit was a divestiture, as I just discussed. One unit having been sold off, and here it was exactly the case. I think without winning the trust of the business that was divesting out of that organization, it would have been very hard to complete the process. We really had to go into a lot of detail around the scoping and the data privacy. And actually being a third party in the scenario in some ways was a help, because we could kind of prove to have both organizations' interests at heart. But certainly that was the most important part of the project, was working with that and defining those boundaries. Another example, a global fintech organization. This one was interesting in that the organization were two very large fintech organizations emerging, but going to a new corporate identity, and they actually made the decision to create a net new tenant. And this was interesting. And again, a lot of cooperation, because it's in everyone's best interest to get all the settings and really take advantage and opportunity to improve security and governance and make sure there's a smooth migration. But probably the thing we had here was lesson that there's no one tool or one size fits all solution. These were large organizations previously. Both the founding organizations had also grown by acquisition. So we had, I think it was more than 12 domains from an identity and management perspective, which all needed to be synchronized onto the new tenant, so that when, for example, users changed their passwords, that was synchronized properly through into the new platform. And literally you can land up with a help desk getting flooded. They also had, various different workloads, such as archives and various other things that needed to be taken into account. So really a case of understanding the situation, making sure we had a number of different tool sets. Some of the organizations, for example, weren't actually physically linked by a network, and some of that synchronization needed to be done over secure internet connections. So yeah, absolutely. Sometimes you certainly need to think out of the box and look at some of the different tooling. So I think that's a good point for me to hand over to Johan. He's going to talk a little bit more the kind of technical aspects and where the real world technical rubber hits the road. Probably give a bit more context to what I've been talking about. So over to you, Johan.
Thank you, Chris. So now that we've established why there is a requirement for completing a tenant-to-tenant migration, I think the next step is to start unpacking and understanding what is involved with migrating your organization to a new tenant, understanding what is in scope of your tenant-to-tenant migration. And for any organization that's going through this process, we recommend a few key questions that you need to ask as part of this migration process. The first one is that we recommend that all organizations need to go through a full IT landscape discovery and analysis process. They need to make sure that they understand what they currently have and how all their on-premise and online and cloud-only environments integrate with the Microsoft 365 landscape and start unpacking those interdependencies so that there isn't any unforeseen scope creep or bumps within the road of your migration journey. 4 key questions that we recommend all clients take into account during this discovery phase to identify your migration scope is the 4 listed on screen. The first one being that you understand what your environment will look like after the migration. In a lot of organizations and complex Office 365 tenants, during a migration process, the source and target environment in most cases doesn't align with how it's currently configured and deployed. A lot of times, the source tenant might be in a hybrid deployment with on-premise Active Directory and Exchange Online service and Exchange services, whereas the target organization might be fully cloud adopted with no on-premise resource integration. That would mean the change of hybrid to cloud only is a condition that needs to be considered as part of this migration journey to your new tenant. The next question is understanding all the interdependencies and how they will be interrupted from an end user perspective. For an example, would be how users access to their files on their home drives or their mail will be interrupted as part of the tenant-to-tenant migration process. And then also how they continue to access Teams and SharePoint while that data is in progress of being migrated to the target tenant. Another question is important to ask is there any compliance or security or archiving changes that needs to be taken into account as part of this migration journey. For example, does the source organization use third-party backup or archiving solutions within their current mail and messaging platforms? And what is required to migrate that content to the target Exchange Online environment? Or is there a requirement for other third-party solutions for hosting the backup and archiving data that is currently stored within the third-party provider? And the last and mostly important question is understanding the compliance and security requirements from both organizations and making sure that they are aligned as part of this migration process. In most scenarios with enterprise and complex organizations, the two tenants might not have the same compliance and security configurations in their Office 365 tenants, and they might not even have the same capabilities that's limited by Microsoft 365 licenses that's currently in use. So assessing the compliance and security settings on both tenants and making sure that they are aligned as part of this migration journey is a key to having a successful migration to your new tenant. During our previous tenant-to-tenant migration experiences, we've identified 4 key complex technical requirements that will assist with improving the end user experience during the migration process. The first one being a common address list. Having a common address list, not only in Exchange Online services, but also within Teams, gives the end users the ability to have a central address list that spans both organizations and both tenants to improve their collaboration and teamwork during their day-to-day operational perspective and work they need to complete. So having a solution in place that offer and can manage a centralized and automated common address list will really be beneficial to your migration to the new tenant. The next challenge is managing a current limitation in Microsoft 365 is the ability to only have a custom domain on a single tenant. During a lot of acquisitions and mergers, the organization wants to complete the rebranding from day one. And having the ability to utilize domain sharing and rewrite services offers the organization the ability to mask the rebranding from the outside world by allowing the users to communicate with a single domain to the outside world while still on the back end completing the data migration from the source to the target tenant. The third complex consideration that needs to be accounted for during the migration is users' identities and credentials. With Microsoft 365 and especially the current hybrid environment, Active Directory and on-premise user identities is deeply integrated within Azure Active Directory, and ensuring that that integration is migrated to the target tenant is a key success factor for the migration from an end user perspective. Having the ability to synchronize not only users' identities and accounts, but also their passwords will make it smoother for the user to switch their accounts and various clients, such as their Outlook or their Teams client, to the target tenant, by allowing them to only remember the new domain if the domain is changing as part of the migration, but at least have the ability to use the same shared password that is synchronized across the two separate tenants. And then lastly, and probably most important and the most complex, is the migration of endpoint devices and ensuring the devices stays managed. The same as identities, endpoints in enterprise and complex tenant deployments is fully integrated within Azure AD and Endpoint Device Manager, or Intune as it was previously known. So ensuring these policies and configurations and even the enrollment of devices is planned for and completed as part of the migration to the new tenant is key to the success factor, and it probably have the biggest impact from an end user experience by shifting their mobile devices and their Windows devices as part of the migration will improve the user's day-to-day operational lives tremendously. A good example that we've seen before that summarizes all the key aspects was for a complex Office 365 migration project we did for a construction company in the Nordics. From the onset, it was Exchange migration, but with the requirement of ingesting third-party archive data into the Exchange Online. And through that process, through the initial discovery, it was identified that the amount of data, especially within the levers data within the third-party archive, will dictate the timeframes and how we are migrating the users to Exchange Online to ensure that they can start consuming the Exchange Online services while the legacy archive data is ingested at a slower pace into the Exchange Online environment. For that reason, we specifically broke up the different interdependent or interlinked user technologies by focusing on completing the user's mailbox and OneDrive migration before moving on to the Teams and SharePoint deployment. So during the initial phases, we onboarded their mailboxes and also onboarded their home drives into their personal OneDrives within the tenant. And that was specifically split out as we see that as user-owned data in most organizations. And then after that was completed, we moved on to deploying Teams and SharePoint by migrating legacy file data into SharePoint and Teams sites as part of the deployment journey. So I think at that stage, I'll hand over to Chris that will elaborate more on the complexities around aligning the compliance and security across the two tenants as part of the migration journey. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Johan. Yeah, I think you've alluded to quite a lot of really some of the things I'm going to just cover in maybe a little bit more of the background detail, and that's really around establishing that security and governance baseline and these elements. And I think as what we've seen is that as organizations have started using Office 365 more as the ecosystem that it is, rather than just an email and file platform. So now what we see is you're not just migrating the emails and the mail system and the documents within, the documents or the legacy data within archives. There's also the glue that surrounds Office 365 on both, and that glue really exists in two areas, but one in the security side, which Johan has spoken to a few of those things already, and then also in the governance side. So there are a number of things that really need to be balanced, other than just the content that's being migrated. We've really seen this as the new perimeter. So especially with COVID and the people needing to be able to function really efficiently and securely from working from home or remotely, it's been a critical requirement, really, that it doesn't matter if you're migrating, these things need to be in place. So there needs to be in place on both sides, and the security elements have really taken on, I think, a lot more weight in these complex migrations. We also see that two organizations may be at different levels of maturity, and the thing about Office 365 is the platform will be upgraded and the security and governance elements will be put there whether you like it or not. You don't have any control over what Microsoft will release. But you may have, for example, held back on certain features and functions. You may have held back on external sharing or Teams collaboration externally, and the other organization might not have. So there's an important area here of balancing out those requirements, making sure the maturity levels from the security and the governance side of things are balanced and in both interests. Sometimes the smaller organization, which is being swallowed up by a larger organization, may be more advanced, maybe using more advanced features, but the bigger organization isn't ready for that yet. So a conversation really needs to be had around what's going to be the best for the joint venture going forward. So we've seen that this is almost the traditional rhythm of upgrading from Exchange to 2010 to the new versions of things is really gone. But what we do see is organizations are on a continual kind of gradual maturity, sort of maturation cycle of using these governance and security features. Obviously, some of those that Johan has already mentioned on the security side, but also on the content management side or on the information governance side, we have things like data policies, the different types of data protection. So it could be labels. So one organization may have done a lot of work around data classification and labeling and information protection and the policies that drive the protection of the information based on the labels that have been set up. So now if you're suddenly bringing a new organization into the fold, there really needs to be both some change management and some decisions made on how that'll be deployed, or if it'll be delayed, or what's acceptable to allow this balance to be created between the organizations. So just moving on to some of some of the lessons learned that we've had over time. One particular example where we saw this really work quite well and landed up working together with the organization to develop a process where they're a large multinational, were originally quite federated, so different organizations in different regions in the pharmacare space. And what they did as they were onboarding and bringing the regions in, we established what we called a security baseline, a security and governance baseline process. And there would actually be meetings set up with both the information management teams, the governance and compliance, as well as the IT teams. This allowed the organizations to really understand what security and governance elements were in place before they were migrated onto the platform. And that also gives them, some confidence in what's there, and then also gave them the ability to customize their requirements. So the security baseline was set as kind of a global minimum and a global best practice, and then you would need to have, as one of the regions, you'd have to have a very good reason to depart from that global best practice, but you also had the opportunity to then add things like local identification numbers, passport numbers, perhaps product codes for things like the data leak prevention policies, or specific data leak prevention requirements that you may have in your geographic region, or for socio-political, or just because of business practice and production requirements. we in fact recently engaged with another chemical firm that had the opposite problem. They had been onboarded and had adopted Office 365, and it called us in to help deal with a content management problem they had on file servers. And the question we asked was, you want us to solve a file server problem, but why is it that you're not using Office 365? What is the problem? And it turned out they'd been onboarded with very little communication, and we're really just using it, kind of being forced to use it just for email and maybe some OneDrive workloads, but hadn't really adopted it as a business. And we were able to help them get those meetings set up with the global head office, understand what was in place, then get their customer requirements in place, which obviously meant they won trust in the platform and are now able to collaborate going forward and get the content migrated over into Office 365 as it probably should have been, but also with that confidence and with their requirements met and documented. Yeah, so I think that's probably all I needed to get through for the minute, and I'm going to hand over, I think, to Brandon, who's going to take us through, I think, some more of the people side of things and some of the change management aspects and elements and communication. Thanks, Brandon. Over to you.
No problem. Thanks, man. So yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about how we ensure the smooth transition of migration and how we minimize the impact on those specific users. So this is one of the most vital parts of any migration. Ensuring a smooth transition can be managed through enabling a good communication strategy generally, and also building a proper pre-migration plan. Those are the two main factors and the easiest ways of ensuring your company is going to have a smooth transition from one tenant to another tenant, or a legacy system into Office 365, or any other like-for-like type migrations. So if we go to the next slide, you will see we focus and talk a little bit about communication success factors and what that means and what that looks like inside of your organization. So I will break it down into two pieces, as we spoke before: communication strategy and pre-migration considerations as part of the success factors in ensuring the smooth transition. So knowing your workforce is vitally important. Understanding that you've got baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Zs inside of your organization will help you build the proper communication strategy in order to get collateral and content out to these specific users to enable them on the new platform that you are deploying and migrating to from either an existing tenant, and there are some like-for-like examples there that are important to communicate, or from a legacy system into Office 365. So the scope of the workforce will generally define which workloads are adopted quickly in your organization, so to enable a more engaged approach. And then based on what you can see in the specific slide, you'll see there that there are preferences. So 2020 definitely changed a lot of the way that these users interact with each other across the different generations. Everybody working at home and having a lot of change fatigue, because there's been a lot of change, a lot of stress, and a lot of pressure, and also having the lack of office-based and informal Q&A advocacy around these changes. You've got to build these models into the technology platforms to allow the users to engage with each other, to understand what's happening during the migration process. So change management activities are key to these successful migrations, because user adoption is definitely at the forefront of the productivity and the reason why you would generally be doing this migration. So let's use a like-for-like example. You're moving from one tenant to another tenant, so you would think that it would be a pretty smooth transition, and generally it is quite a smooth transition for the user. We're not talking about the migration itself or how the back end works of that, but from a user perspective, they don't have to necessarily use any new platform. They're going to continue to use the same platform. However, there might be policy changes on your new tenant that did not exist on the previous tenant of the previous business that you might have acquired during an acquisition, as an example. One of those is external sharing. You might have allowed external sharing before, and as Chris and Johan have discussed throughout this presentation, that there's quite a lot to do in the security and governance space, and adapt and adopt and change, give you the capability to change a couple of things during this migration process. So you might have allowed users to share data or content previously, and now they're not allowed to share data or content in OneDrive or Teams, as an example. And that's a big impact on the users. So communicating that correctly to the users is vitally important, helping them understand why that has happened and how they can work around that, and what the new way of working is exceptionally important to allow them to continue to be productive and not be adherent to not wanting to use a new platform or not wanting to be as productive because they feel that things have been taken away from them. So let's talk a bit about quickly creating some change management and adoption strategies and how we do that. So there is you can do a couple of things like internal email campaigns showing the users what is to come. You can do things like creation of a community for users, create a Q&A in Teams, because it's a very widely used platform. You can do it in Yammer and SharePoint as well if you want to allow users to go and ask other users questions. You could do things like sending out helpful tips on how to use specific workloads for collaboration. Those things are nice and important, enabling your users. You can do things like talking up front about these new policies and these like-for-like migrations, right? So why has it changed? What's the reason for that? And you can communicate that to them. You can assign workload champions, or power users, as we like to call them, to help struggling users and alleviate that pressure off of IT. IT are busy with the migration, they're busy with a lot of context and content and moving that across and making sure everything moves across according to plan. And in that specific process, you can assign these workload champions or power users and get the users to interact with them and get them to help the users use the new technology platforms or help enable them in a better way and alleviate that pressure off of IT. So we have built this user runbook, and it's stemmed from complex migrations and that we've done in the past, like Notice to Exchange. We're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to hand over to Jan to do that. But before I do that, I also want to talk to you a little bit about the pre-migration considerations in this factor, and that's why this user runbook is exceptionally important, because it helps us build a communication plan. We can do communication based on as you can see per the image here. We can do things like T-16 weeks to completion of migration. We can start sending out to specific AD groups the type of communication plan based on that. But as part of that, we also build in these pre-migration considerations. And what is that? Well, things like considering if you want to necessarily have a pilot phase to your migration strategy. Pilot testing is one of the most important pre-migration factors. It allows you the opportunity to test the throughputs, new data structures, permissions, and remediate all of that prior to doing the migration. Once you have that all in place and you actually then start the migration, the transition from the one tenant to another tenant or one specific legacy platform to Office 365, it will allow a very smooth transition because you've tested everything, you know it's going to work, you know how it's going to look in the end, and those pilot phases are exceptionally important in allowing you to do that as well. And then you could also do things like considering a phased approach. Phased approaches in a migration are very important because they design the migration approach, and it will also you will also then consider the impact of the users in their day-to-day function. You will build it all into this runbook, and you will be able to then use this to actually manage the migration process. And Johan will talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to hand over to Johan to talk a bit about the user runbook and explain to you how we use this effectively in the helping with a smooth transition in these specific migrations. Johan, thanks.
Thanks, Brandon. So I think we use and we recommend most organizations use a similar process when they are progressing through a tenant-to-tenant migration. And our runbook process was born out of really complex migrations we often did before, especially notes to Exchange migrations. Those are natively very complex migrations that require a detailed communication plan, not only for marketing the change of platform, because notes to Exchange is a big change from an end user's perspective, but also detailing all the steps that the end user will need to complete as part of the migration journey. And if the users don't complete the required steps, their success will not be as good as the user that followed the steps, and they'll have data missing in their Exchange mailboxes as part of those specific migration scenarios. So we recommend that you utilize a runbook and develop a runbook as part of your initial planning and piloting and testing of your migration to your new tenant. And the runbook is built to trigger specific activities in a countdown fashion that leads up to the actual migration or cutover for the wave of users. So for example, T-16, it will trigger a communication, email-based communication to the end users with a link to an instructional video of what Exchange is and what Exchange Online is and what changes they will encounter as part of the migration. And as you progress further down the runbook, certain end user activities might be triggered in T-14. For example, they might be required to stop making changes to their home folders for a specific period of time. So the runbook is really built for and to handle complex communication requirements and ensuring you've got all the activities tracked and listed and ensure that the automated communication is triggered at the right time to the end users. And it also keeps track of the technical steps that the migration team will be required to complete in the back end before and during the migration to ensure that the users being completed on that target date is complete in lead up to the cutover migration. So I think here I'll hand over back to Laura. She'll wrap up and close today's session for us before we lead into the question. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Johan. Yeah, so just before we kind of wrap up and open the Q&A, we've got a couple of questions to get through, so please chuck some more if you've got them into the question panel. But yeah, so before we conclude, we did just want to touch on the sort of the acceleration phase out of a tenant migration, because looking back, it's really something that has sort of set apart some of the tenant migration projects that we've been involved in over and above others. And it's not necessarily anything to do with the migration path itself, but more to do with sort of the proactive stance that the IT team have taken to really move the business forward with its digital transformation out of a tenant migration. And it very much loops back to the kind of why question that Chris started with, that wider context for migration, which will probably be rooted in the business gaining some form of competitive advantage. So, you know, the project really needing to create those conditions under which the business can make that kind of progress. And, you know, short term, that probably looks like accelerating out of the tenant migration, having made it a slick process where people are communicating seamlessly, and, you know, perhaps the brand is now seen as one, and you can really feed on that success story both internally and to the outside world. But successful acceleration can also sort of play itself out in many different ways. You know, for some projects where the business has been maybe a late adopter to the cloud, you know, we've seen that acceleration in the form of proper Teams adoption, you know, giving collaboration a massive boost. For others, that acceleration has come in the form of rationalizing for cost reduction, you know, shaking off legacy technologies that have been consuming way too much IT budget and IT resource for way too long. For others, acceleration has looked like sort of rethinking Office 365 license plans across the business, you know, getting cost efficiencies, getting more value out of functionality, putting in more centralized administration across the global tenant. Others, it's looked more like engaging with compliance team much more directly to kind of design how you tap into compliance features, etc. So we're absolutely not saying take on a load of extra initiatives as part of your tenant migration. Don't overcomplicate matters. You know, heed Johan's advice to very carefully scope what's in and what's out. But, you know, from what we've observed, more success comes from when you've got an eye on actually what acceleration out of the migration looks like for your business, so you can then use that to guide decision making in the tenant design, in the migration design, and ultimately sort of get quicker wins really as you move forward and accelerate out of a tenant project. So on that note leads me to wrap up before we go into Q&A. So I think if we were to sort of sum up our lessons learned that we've tried to sort of communicate in this session, it would be that firstly, there are a lot of tenant migration technologies out there, and we certainly use some of the best of them, but unlike single sort of workload migrations, you know, the wider business context massively shapes the priorities of a tenant migration and the challenges that you're going to hit and the migration design that you're ultimately going to need. And secondly, as Johan advises, you know, spending time in that discovery phase, really painting a picture of what the new environment is going to look like, auditing the workloads that you've got, and what needs to be in scope is time incredibly well spent. And thirdly, as Chris talked through, you know, we really recommend some form of baselining process to align security and governance controls when you're consolidating or, you know, setting that global standard, but also to use that process as your sort of starting point for, you know, accelerating and building roadmaps for future adoption of features within the tenant as you move forward. Fourthly, as Brandon spoke to, you know, investing time in that communication plan and being very mindful of the current context really around change and people's experience of change, certainly over the past year, and things that people are going through right now as they kind of battle to do their jobs using the technology. And yeah, as Johan mentioned, maybe tactics like that run book can be really, really helpful. And you know, fifth, just defining those goals for acceleration out of the migration, because, you know, the tenant migration can actually serve as a catalyst for some very tangible progress for the business. And, you know, from our perspective, if that acceleration out of a migration like this involves further migrations or initiatives around managing your content and advancing security and compliance over your content, that's certainly something right up our street. So we'd be very excited to work with you on that. So that wraps up sort of the content for today, and we'll certainly send a link to this recording, and you are very welcome to find us and pick our brains further, but just to spend a couple of minutes now tackling, I've got two questions, actually three questions to get through.
Yeah, another one just came in, Laura.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and I think they are probably Johan, if you can be primed and ready. So the first one, which, yeah, I think kind of loops into the context for migration, but speaks to capability new for Microsoft. So the question is, are you able to comment on the recently announced preview ability to rename your 365 tenant across SQL, OneDrive, Teams, and how this affects or will affect the need to perform a tenant-to-tenant migration if it is a rebrand scenario, so not an actual merger acquisition. So Johan, are you good to tackle that?
Yeah, I'm good. I think Brandon will add his point of view on that. But yeah, I think that was one of the first requirements for completing tenant migrations, where organization, when they created their Office 365 tenant, it was left to an IT techie that didn't choose a proper domain, and the organization not understanding that domain is the domain that's going to be used when they share content externally or when resources access that tenant. So a lot of organizations needed to go through a tenant migration to change that simple on Microsoft domain that is your domain name, your primary domain name. So the ability to rename that hasn't been publicly released yet, and obviously it's currently in some form of limited preview. And there's still a lot of open-ended questions around the process, specifically how will external resources that has been shared externally continue to be accessible after the change. But yeah, obviously, once that feature becomes fully available and supported by Microsoft, it will eliminate the requirement to do a tenant-to-tenant migration specifically for just rebranding and no other specific requirements. So Brandon, I don't know if you want to mention anything else on that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jan. So Jan hit the nail on the head. It's from a rebranding perspective, it's a really great feature, and we're glad Microsoft have brought this after about 9 years, right? So it's been a very long time. But there are some considerations because it's in preview. Not everything is built correctly, and when doing something, even if you are in private preview, you've got to be very careful because there are some very high impact capabilities that are not available for you when doing this. And those things are around restoring your data and managing old content. So, and if you're in a multi-geo location as well. So if you have deleted sites, as an example, you will not be able to restore those sites after the name change because the data doesn't exist that way. You can't just do it using a Microsoft capability. You'll need a backup platform or tool to be able to do that. So you need to have that in place first. So please consider that. Any point in time restoration, same thing, cannot be done. If you do a name change in this specific way using the preview, you'll need a backup platform to assist you in that process. So you've got to understand and manage that. And then if you have a multi-geo deployment of Office 365, unfortunately, then this preview is not available to you. You cannot change it. You still have to do a tenant-to-tenant migration. So I thought I'd just mention a few quick high-impact options or capabilities that are not within the specific scope within the preview. So just consider those when you're deciding to do this in that way. Do some research and reach out to a couple of the guys, but that's quite important to know. Awesome. That's what I've got.
Thanks, guys. So second question, I think these are queuing up for you, Johan. How do you actually test the identity migration? As you have suggested, aren't these one-time events?
I think, yeah, firstly, the initial identity synchronization, depending on the migration platform and tool set you're utilizing for the tenant-to-tenant migration, is a one event, but most enterprise scale migration platforms, they do Delta, not only content synchronization, but Delta identity synchronization. And that is to ensure that any changes in the source environment during the migration process is synchronized to the target. For if a user has got a surname change to a marriage or a position change and their title needs to change, we need to ensure that those type of identity parameters are synchronized as part of the migration. And so testing the identity synchronization and migration is a key part of our piloting and user acceptance testing phase, where you, through test accounts and pilot accounts and champions, you ensure that you do end-to-end user scenario testing and identify any pitfalls or any issues you encounter across the migration journey. So that's why I think, like Brandon mentioned, your pilot, your user acceptance testing is really a key area to determine the success of your migration once you hit the production migration to all your end users.
Thanks, Johan. So third question for you. Other than AAD as a core shared component between the two environments, are there significant impacts to or considerations for Microsoft Azure that need to be taken into account when completing a tenant-to-tenant migration?
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of considerations, specifically with Microsoft Azure and how integrated it is as a cloud platform. Obviously, Microsoft 365 runs on your Azure AD not only manages your identities and access for your Office 365 as a service, but also your roles, permissions, and access to majority of your Microsoft Azure resources. So from previous scenarios, we've seen that the requirement of Azure DevOps and the considerations around that is something that needs to be considered. So that's key around the initial discovery, is understanding, like I mentioned, not only your Microsoft 365 landscape, but your full IT landscape. That is your on-premise environment, your cloud-based environments, and then also your hybrid deployments. So definitely unpacking what you currently have in Azure and how it's integrated within Azure AD and your Microsoft 365 tenant is really key to define your migration scope and your path going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's, let me just check. I think that is all questions covered for today. So yeah, we'll leave it there. Thank you everyone for joining and the presenters here today. We'll send the recording out and our details are here. So track us down and pick our brains further if you need to, particularly Johan for the technical side of things.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Everyone.
Thank you much, everybody.
Have a good day.
Cheers.
Have a good day.